Welcome to Crisis and Hope, YU Voices. Crisis and Hope is a project of the Center for Israel Studies, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies and Judaic Studies at YU Mada'ei HaYahadut. My name is Ronnie Perelis. I'm a professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University. And today I welcome you to a very special installment of our series dedicated to the upcoming holiday of Pesach, titled Seeing Matzah from Talmudic Times to the Medieval Haggadot. And when we began this series in June, we wanted to create a forum that would go beyond the headlines and tweets and talking points that often pass for political and cultural discourse. We wanted a space for nuance, depth, and perspective. We believe that the past can inform and bring light to the present and even give us hope in moments of confusion and despair. For that reason, I'm so honored to invite you all here today with my friend, Professor Stephen Fine, who is the Jurgen Professor of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University and the director of the Center of Israel Studies at Yeshiva University, and a dear friend of mine and a teacher of mine, and someone who I've learned so much from over the years in our conversations. And it's really a pleasure. And I see some friendly faces, people I know. It's really an honor to have you all here. And thank you for taking time out of your day, Erev Pesach, to explore something beautiful and interesting. So without any further ado, let's get into the material. I wanted to start with an opening question, which is, I know that Professor Fine has been interested in the depictions of matzah for a long time, but I don't know why or where that came from. And so, Steve, where does that come from? Where did you?
First of all, Ronnie, let me say how happy I am to be here with you, and that our project, Crisis and Hope, which has been going now for almost 6 months or even more, is growing and becoming a real voice for Yeshiva University and for the Jewish community as a whole. So I'm very, very excited. I was really fortunate as a college student on education abroad at the Hebrew University when Professor Dov Noy, who was my teacher, sent me off to the Department of Jewish Art at the Israel Museum and said, you should volunteer there. So I knocked on the gate, met a woman named Chaya Benjamin, who was then the curator. And Chaya didn't want to let me in, another Dov Noy student. She quickly found out that I read Mordechai Narkis's Menorah Chanukah, the Hanukkah lamp, in high school, which is a pretty rare thing to read since it's published in 1939 in atrociously 1939 Hebrew. And she let me in. And she told me during the course of our time together that I had to touch every artifact in the collection. That was her rule.
Touch, literally, with your hands.
With my hands. I had to pick them up and touch them and know them. Chaya is an object person, and touching is essential to understanding objects. And so one of the objects that she took out of the safe for me was called the Bird's Head Haggadah. And another one was called the Yehuda Haggadah. And I turned the pages and I turned the pages and I turned the pages, and I couldn't believe I was touching these things. And soon after that, I was taking a Hebrew manuscripts course with Bezalel Narkis at the Hebrew University on Haggadot. And he said, what are you interested in? And I said, matzah baking. And he said, what? He said, matzah baking. Because usually people were interested, the pictures of Yocheved and the pictures of all those biblical scenes. That's what had been studied for 100 years. But no one had bothered to look at the Jewish customs. Now, that continued with my master's degree at the University of Southern California with a fellow named Stephen Kaiser, who founded the Jewish Museum in New York, and an Indian professor named Pratapadichya Pal, who didn't think studying matzah was strange at all because he studied India. Right? Now, this was the moment, Ronnie, when macrame Judaism had developed. This was the moment of the Jewish catalog, when people were illustrating their own ketubot, when people were writing their own Haggadot, when doing things yourself, making your own Havdalah candle, making your own talit was what was in the air. And it's not surprising that Chabad at that moment decided that making matzah should be in the air too. And so they brought this new thing to Southern California that none of us had ever seen, really, when I was a kid, hand matzah baking. I mean, we'd seen the matzah, but we'd never actually done it, right? So when those two things sort of came together, these wonderful manuscripts, people who thought this was cool, and a cultural moment when matzah is no longer just matzah, right? It is a cultural object. It is a performance art in the baking process. It's just everything you would imagine and hope for in deep and exciting culture. And I had it illustrated on pages of manuscripts. And so that's where this matzah thing started. All of you who grew up with those awful square matzah that Mr. Manischewitz foisted upon us that look like bricks, they're sort of like electric eternal lights, or better yet, Yortzeit candles, right? Or menorahs that have light bulbs, or all those other canned gefilte fish, right? All of us who grew up with that, the idea that you could touch a matzah and make a matzah and see a matzah come out of the oven and all of that craft stuff involved, for me was just like, wow. And so that's where this came from, all that stuff together.
So the centrality of materiality of things, right? The thingness of things and how that fits into people's lives.
Well, I was always a person who did things. In fact, I could see and touch art before I could actually read, because I had an eye muscle problem that kept me from reading for a couple of years into school. And so I could analyze a painting long before I could read a text. So when my text skills came together, then it became a head with two sides that were almost balanced between seeing and reading. And then when it comes to matzah, tasting. And that's and holding up and being with, right?
Feeling
and so it's that
it.
very
You bake
tactile.
You bake it, the need to, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's that very tactile thing, right? That there are people out there who would tell me, and Richard McBee's here, that the matzah coming out of the matzah bakery is the art. And I would agree with him completely.
Right. Steve, what's the oldest thing? What's the first thing we're going to look at today?
Let me show you some pictures. I'm going to share screen. Okay. With God's help, it's going to work, right? It worked. Yes. Present. Voila. And it's working again. Let me change the slide. Now, do the slides go is the question. Boom. It's not moving, is it? I don't know why, but it's not moving. I love it when it works until it doesn't. Oh, let me escape and try it again. Present.
Present mode.
It's not moving. It's supposed to. I'll just do it the other way. Okay. Boop.
Okay, we can do it one by one.
We'll do it the other way.
Okay.
Present. Good. What you're looking at are some breads that were baked more than 2,000 years ago in July in 79 AD in the city of Pompeii. That's the thing on the bottom, that gray piece of cinder, which is a loaf of bread. You can see illustrations of what bread looked like in the bakeries as they were being sold. They have they are perforated so that they can both be the same shape all the time, and so they can be broken easily. Right now, that's the oldest piece of bread that we can look at from this period. Now, remember that matzah in Talmudic times wasn't that little thin cracker that we eat today. That thin cracker is a very Eastern European phenomenon. Isserles says in his gloss to the Shulchan Aruch, essentially the thinner the better, and that's where we get the crackers. But in the Middle Ages, they were as thick as a finger. And in antiquity, it could be up to 4 fingers thick. And that's about the size of this loaf of bread. You'll see with the angle, the arrow that I put on the screen on the loaf of bread points to a little rectangle. that's where a bread stamp was impressed into the dough. It tells you that a person who was a slave, who had his own bakery, made this loaf of bread. Some people remember when Israeli bread came with a little sticker sticking out of it that said, "Hi, I'm from Angel Bakery." Right? It's the same phenomenon. This is the advertisement. Jewish bread stamps were also used during this period. A whole bunch of them have been discovered. Just recently, I've been writing on one that was found in the city of Sardis, not probably in the region of the ancient synagogue. But what I want to share with you is the one on the screen. You see a bread stamp. It's really only about 2 inches across. And you can see in the image up above, the letters are backwards, because when it's impressed upon the bread, of course, it becomes the way it's supposed to be. All those little nibs on the top of the letters, that's standard Talmudic period letter script form. And of course, once I turn it around, you can read it. It says La Pesach. In other words, somebody 1,500 years ago created this bread stamp to mark either bread or maybe wine jars, but to create a stamp like the one that slave used in Pompeii, except here for the purpose of Pesach, the Shem Mitzvot Pesach, right? We see the attempt to mark the matzah. So you can imagine that the earliest matzah kind of sort of might have looked like this. Thickness wasn't an issue, as some people will know, in the Syrian community, it still isn't an issue. Ashkenazim have gone really thin. And so that's really a cool object.
Steve, a really practical question here. The image from Pompeii, that is a loaf of bread that was like preserved because of the ash, or it's become like a fossil? Like what are we looking? What actually are we looking at there?
It's a fossil. It's like a fossil
caused by the volcano.
Yes, this is what you see is the leftover ash that stayed solid and filled up with minerals. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. Just like a fossil.
Right, just like a fossil.
Right, and up above, you see it on the table of the bread store.
Yeah,
it's really cool. Take a look at this. This is the Synagogue Mosaic from Sipori, which I've looked at a lot of times. This is supposed to be the table for the showbread, the Shulchan Lechem Panim. I've had trouble with that because this round thing in the middle, it doesn't fit what we would expect the showbread table to look like. But then again, the showbread table, the way Josephus describes it, doesn't sound the way we would expect it as well. He calls it a Delphic table. Apparently somebody took a table. They said, make a table. He made a table. Great. What do you put on the table? Oh, you put 12 loaves. Where do I put the 12 loaves? I don't know. Right. And so there is somebody who is doing his best to turn a standard Greco-Roman table into a Shulchan Lechem Panim, by and by creating for us images of bread on top of the table, these little loaves. But more to the point, more importantly, these loaves that he placed on the side with this crosshatch pattern, which isn't so different from what we saw before in our Pompeii bread. Remember that in rabbinic thought, at least, the bread of the presence, the lechem panim, is compared always to the matzah because they're both unleavened bread. And so I could imagine someone in the 5th century saying, oh, you're supposed to put it on. What's it supposed to look like? It's supposed to look like, unleavened bread. Oh, unleavened bread, that's matzah. Here it is. So I could imagine this being an image of matzah, sort of 3rd tier, because this is what this sort of bread would have looked like in that period, which is pretty cool. I just thought of this one yesterday, and I think it's right, but I'm not sure. And I'm playing with it.
And this mosaic had other temple features?
Yeah, right next to you. You see the birdie? That's the basket for the bikurim, for the first fruits. And to the left, there's a sacrificial animal. And since he's supposed to be sacrificed with flour That's that stacked up triangular stuff. It also says solid in case you missed it, right? And shemen in case you missed that. That's the stuff in the bottle. Anything that the artist had to actually create on his own, he tended to do poorly. Anything he could take from a copybook, he tended to do better. And so his basket is better than his table, which is still better than his three-dimensionality. It's just, you can watch this artist trying to figure out how to make what was demanded of him without having real models. It's a fascinating mosaic.
It's a great place to visit also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I switch to the next one?
Yeah, please.
Okay. You're looking at members of the Samaritan community on Mount Gerizim. It's Jamal Cohen in the center. I have a large project with the Samaritans. It's called the YU Israelite Samaritan Project, which is an exhibition and which will open at the Museum of the Bible in the fall and hopefully go to Israel after that. It's a major book. It's a children's book. It's a cookbook that you can buy on Amazon today. And it's a documentary film made with the Keren HaChadashah L'Kolnoa, the new fund for film, for cinema and television, directed and produced by my dear friend Moshe Alafi of Jerusalem. It's called Lahatzil et Ha'edah, or in English, The Samaritans, a Biblical People. These are scenes from our shooting for the documentary and for the exhibition. Samaritans, of course, also use matzah. And on Pesach to this day, you can go and see the maror being placed on the matzah. And then on the right, they are eating the matzah and the paschal sacrifice together with the maror. And so you can see how it actually is being done today. And the reason I'm showing this is, number one, because it is a kind of thin, flat bread. Those Samaritans use salt because it's a sacrifice. They insist there be salt in the matzah. And also, they use store-bought flour, which since the time of Rava, since the 4th century in Babylonia, just wouldn't work in the best case for Jews. But what's interesting to me for our purposes is this text in the Tosefta from the 3rd century, which says the matzah of Samaritans, of Kutim, which is a pejorative, it may be eaten by a Jew in order to fulfill his Passover obligations. In other words, you can go to the Shomroni next door and say, "Hi, can I buy some matzah from you?" and use it on Passover. But it's not true, because Rabbi Elazar, sometime after Bar Kokhba, forbade it. Why? Not because it's treif, not because they're not somehow related to Israel. It's because because they are not careful. In other words, they're not deliberate the way we are in how they make it. Then there's this amazing general principle, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, by the patriarch, right? Shimon ben Gamliel. Kol mitzvah shechaziku ba kutim harbe medaktikin yoter mi-Yisrael. They're more careful than Jews are. Now, you won't be surprised that this was a moment. By the 3rd century, the Amoraim had wiped that one off the books. But it's a moment of real closeness between the destruction of the temple and the decade after, and the century after, when Jews and Samaritans were in this connectedness. So there's a lot of cool stuff we can find on 1,000 different levels for understanding Talmudic texts dealing with matzah, including Samaritans today. I just point out that where the Jewish text says al motzot u'maror yochluhu, the Samaritan text says, simplifying the text, yochlu oto. They shall eat the matzah and the maror together with the sacrifice. So that's what this ensemble is.
They pack the matzah with the bitter herbs on top?
They make it into a kind of, like how you make shawarma.
You roll.
Yeah, they roll it right in.
Uh-huh.
That's what korech means, right? It's, with our hard matzah, it's hard to do it. there are people who today have reached the point where, since they're using hard matzah and they're using soft leafy maror, they will wrap the maror around the matzah instead of the matzah around the maror.
Yeah,
it's an established custom.
I haven't seen that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense a lot. My point is only that it's the transition and the different materials and the decisions that have to be made in each generation. And this is how the Samaritans, after 3,000 years of thinking about it, do it.
So this Tosefta really kind of encapsulates like this dialectic between the Chachamim and the Samaritans, right? Where there's a clear living together, so much so that you would, like you said, go over and buy some matzah if you ran out from your Samaritan neighbor. But then there's a pullback, but then there's an acknowledgement. Yes, we won't take from them, but we understand that they're careful, that they're right. They're medaktakim. They're right, that they're careful with their mitzvot, even though they're not like us. It's there's so much. It's like encased in here in this.
And by the time you get to the 3rd century, Rabbi Yochanan and the student Rabbi Abahu are putting the kibosh on all of this, and the other students in the Beit Midrash in Tiberia cannot figure out what's going on. In other words, there is a real attempt to push both Samaritans and people that Amoraim considered to be Amei Haaretz off the table. Being rich people mostly.
And we're talking in Eretz Yisrael.
In Tiberias. We even know where, right?
Where? Sipori?
In Tiberia, and in this case in Caesarea with Rabbi Abahu. There were together, Jews and Samaritans were the majority population in late antique Caesarea. Christians were the minority.
Till what point? Till 4th century?
For much longer. When Caesarea fell and became just as nothing in the Islamic period, it was still a mixed Jewish and Samaritan population with a smaller population of Gentiles. We know that from Benjamin and Tudela.
Mm-hmm. Wow,
it's really neat.
Yeah.
Let me pull us a little bit forward.
Well, I want to just invite everyone in the audience. If you have a question, send it into the chat. If it's something connected directly to something here, I'll pass it on to Professor Fine. But otherwise, we'll have time at the end for sure for questions. So please feel free to send them into the chat, and I will pass them along. Okay.
And the questions are the best part. So please, please, please. Now, the Babylonian Talmud has an even more interesting question, and that is, how do you make of the 3 different kinds of bread that are discussed in Psachim Lamed Zayin? One of them is called Srikin Hamitsuyarin, which means Syrian bread which is decorated. Okay? And the texts are really clear. You can't use those. Why? Because the women are going to start pashking, and they're going to decide that they're going to make it too beautiful, and then it's going to become chametz, and you can't do it. Then they say, what if you use a mold? Well, if the guy's an expert, you can use a mold. And so if you're going to use a mold, that's great. And so there's a big discussion that a late Second Temple period, early Churban rabbi named Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok went to the house of Rabban Gamliel and saw that they brought him the Syrian bread, all beautiful and decorated with images, right? And they said, but Dad, we're not supposed to do that. And the father's answer is, Abini, lo shel kol adam. You can eat certain bread, but not everybody. Now, that comes down in halakha that only expert bakers can decorate the matzah. And in the 10th century, we have evidence that Jews were making matzah with molds like those that you see before you, with images of birds and fish, and even Greek soldiers. Can you imagine halach ma'anyan and breaking your Greek soldier and eating him? Right? That's exactly what's being described there. Down below, what you see on the right is Greek Orthodox communion bread, which was made in a mold. You can see the mold next to it. You can see how much clarity you can get on such things. And on the left, you can see a modern mold and how careful and how much it can be. But it's true that many traditional scholars, because of the word masrek, interpret srikin as combed bread. But our linguistics have gotten better. And we know of this thing called Syrian bread from other Semitic languages. And so the general consensus today is that when we had not enough information to figure out what srikin could be, not knowing that, you can see the Greek down below, surakoi means Greek, right? Surakoi easily becomes srikin, and that's what happens in other cognate languages as well. Thanks for the question.
Which word is this mean Syrian?
Sriki.
Sriki is
The kuf gets added in.
Okay.
Right? It's Suri. Sure, just look in Jastrow. It's that early. They knew it at the turn of the century. Yeah, Ellie, you can look in Jastrow. He says it all.
So Mitsuyarin is referring to the decorative piece.
Yeah.
Surya. Okay. Yeah.
No, it's decorated bread. Is that not cool? And it could be really thick. And we stopped doing that because we decided that not everybody is an expert. And besides, our bread culture got less and less thick, especially into the modern period, thanks to machine-made bread, right? And so all those wonderful bread things that were done for every holiday fell. And so this fell as well. And besides, the need to make our matzah faster and faster and faster, right, has so overtaken the system. Remember, a Roman mile is 18 to 22 minutes. You can take all that time if you really need to make your matzah. It's an arbitrary measure. But today we can make 3 matzahs in that much time, or 4. And so, you know, it's the attempt to make speed the optimal point over other values, which is interesting. So
at the time that we're talking about, on Pesach, people would have had a thicker bread that would have had these designs if they trusted the baker.
Yeah.
He's following the rabbis here.
Yeah.
And
if they trusted the baker, and if they were wealthy, and if, and most people were impoverished and they did the best they could, and sometimes even had to eat barley or something worse because they couldn't get wheat.
Right. Do we have evidence at that time people are making it in their homes? Like they would make pita?
We have evidence of people making it in their homes into the 20th century all over the Arab world.
Yeah.
The creation of matzah factories, you know, is a modern phenomenon. For example, in Newport, Rhode Island, there's a matzah bakery in the basement of the synagogue. In Baltimore, there's a matzah bakery in the basement of the synagogue. It's something that communities do together. It's something that people do together as a community. As we've gotten stricter and stricter on the baking of matzah, it's become much more of a rabbinic thing.
Right.
But Eli tells me that he does it at home.
Eli's my neighbor, and I know very well that he is part of the Matzah Underground.
So Eli, I'm coming to your house for Pesach. Now, let me show you something else. Oops, which screen am I doing? Okay, this is my buddy. I'm only showing one medieval Haggadah because it represents the whole group. It's around 1300 southern Germany. It's wonderful. For those who are wondering, those are Jews under those Jews' hats. They look like birds. There are a lot of people who've had a lot of theories about why they look like birds. I think the original theory that Narkis wrote about in an article, and that was written about by Spitzer and others, is the right one. And that is that they wanted to make images of human beings, but they didn't trust that they didn't live in an idolatrous environment. And so this was a balancing act. We see that in a number of places in Ashkenazi halacha, that the communities really want this stuff and rabbis are really uncomfortable. And this was a kind of balance. And so you see all these people, the men and the women, all with their beaks. But there are people in these manuscripts that occasionally don't look like birds. And that's where the questions come from. Let's take a look.
Beards. Yeah. Some birds have beards, some birds don't have beards. I wonder if that is, right? That's kind of giving them a little personality.
Well, we also have the bald bearded guy.
The bald guy, yes, the bald man.
A bald guy without the beard, eh? And we have the woman, and there's another woman who's off to the side here. She got cut off in our screen, in my screen at least. And you can see she's mixing the dough.
Yes.
Right, and we've gone through the rolling, and now we're up to the pricking, and you see they're using this thing that looks like a fork.
Right.
One of my favorite parts of this illustration is the passing of the matzah between the woman and the man. There's something very sweet about how they're looking at each other. And whether the artist intended it or not, it turned out really well. Now, this idea of making images in Haggadot, the first images in Haggadot were simply pictures of matzah and maror, where it says matzah zo. When you have the direct object, this matzah, it's almost an invitation to point your finger out and say it's that one, and then make an image in the book. So the first illustrations were simply of the three things that Rabban Gamliel says that everyone has to eat. Quickly, in a culture where custom was central both to Jews and to non-Jews, and the creation of home books, whether they were psalters for Christians or Haggadot for Jews, was on the rise. This became a luxury item. So once you have the luxury item and once you have space, then you can illustrate. And slowly but surely, we get these pictures of whole biblical scenes. The bird's head being a great and wonderful, and they like to say primitive, but I like it too much to say that. Example, if you take a look, after they finish the pricking, he seems to have some power, this guy. They're carrying the matzah to the oven, right? Or taking it out of the oven, I don't know yet, right? But take a look over the head of the guy in the blue suit where I have the cursor. Aleph, Heish, Reish, Nun, Aharon. And over here it says Mem, Shin, Hey, Moshe. Now, why would they label this guy Aaron and this one Moshe? First of all, you can understand why this one would be Moshe, because he's the leader and Aaron follows, and that follows, right? But why? Since the time of the Geonim and even into the Talmud, baking your own matzah was a very, very pious thing to do. There's a story of one sage who was going to bake his own matzah, and the river in Babylonia split for him because it was like Yetziat Mitzrayim. Gaonim would naturally bake their own matzah, but in Ashkenaz it became really something, because Rabbi Meir Rotenberg would bake his matzah exactly at the same time as the Korban Pesach. And so the matzah became a time, place for a replacement for the baking of matzah. Now, the cool thing is that when I was writing about this many years ago, anthropologists like Victor Turner were beginning to think about ritual and transitional time and transitional place and liminality. And it became clear to me that matzah became the thing to do during that liminal transition, when you are sort of here and not here, when you're not matzah and you're still matzah, and it all comes together. And what we're watching here is projection of contemporary custom onto biblical characters, at least by the person who wrote the glosses, and maybe somebody else, right? Once you wrote the glosses, though, everybody would think it until they faded. So it's just amazingly sweet. That's what's so nice about this Haggadah. You know, the Israel Museum produced a beautiful toy version of it where you can make all the parts move. We've gone through 3 of them at our house because we rip it every few years.
Steve, about the liminality and like the need to fill that space, you know, it's also, I know at least in the Brisker world, the neo-Brisker world, there's a real emphasis on making matzah that day, Erev Pesach. I'm sure
Yes.
it endears
Comes from this.
to their households to be doing that Erev Pesach, but it is an act of avoda, right? In place of the Korban Pesach, which you don't do, you can use fire in this other way and bake matzah. And so here you have it, and it's amazing that then it, like you were saying, it gets projected back onto the biblical Exodus experience, where you have a Moshe and Aaron. Yes, and Eli, yes, they sing Hallel while doing it. Yeah, I'm not Zoche. I have not been Zoche yet to do this, but it's an amazing thing.
And different communities do sing different things. There are different
Right.
piyutim in different communities. Ashkenazim, Eastern European Ashkenazim sing Hallel.
Mhm.
And that's an important part. Remember, Ashkenazim have different ways of baking and different kinds of ovens and different technologies, as we'll see in a minute. Let me show you this one. This is much later. It's 1629 Venice, the famous Venice Haggadah. The Venice Haggadah on the right, it's the first page, shows all the customs for getting ready for Pesach. And so there's the boiling of the kalim, the household items on the right, and the cleaning on the left, and Aaron and Moshe, because they've had those plates, they were easy to get on either side, and way up above they are winnowing the wheat. That's really important, because if you see the Ashkenazi Haggadot that show the process of matzah baking, they all start with the moment of grinding, for a very simple reason. Anybody who's been in Northern Europe or Buffalo, New York this time of year knows that there's not too much green coming out yet, right? That's why they use horseradish in Eastern Europe. There was nothing green, and they certainly couldn't get wheat to grind it from the time that it's harvested, or they didn't have apparently the capacity to have done it the previous year. And so, but in Italy, they made a point of grinding it and actually having a meal associated with it, and then taking it down to the bakery over here. But look what's happened. This custom has become a Renaissance custom. It's now at the front of the book because you're preparing for Pesach. They're all dressed in their Shabbos best. The women, 2 women, just as the Mishnah says, this wonderful kneading tool. There's one of these in Baltimore. There's one of these in Turo Synagogue. There's a wonderful one that Avi Nilsson gave to the Israel Museum, or got for the Israel Museum from Gothenburg in Sweden. It looks just like this one at the museum. And what does this kneading thing do? As long as it's kneading, the dough doesn't machmitz, doesn't become chametz. And then all these women producing the matzah, the men taking it out of the oven. You see the power differential going on here. But what's amazing here is the 3-dimensionality and the windows. Right?
What's the importance of the windows?
It shows they're in a room.
Oh, not outside. Right.
Yeah. Some of the medieval Haggadot show grass, mainly because they didn't know quite how to do a foreground. Some of the Christian manuscripts also use grass because they don't know how to do the ground. And so that would lead somebody to think that these illustrations show people baking their matzah outside, but that's only because people forget that illustrations are illustrations, they're not photographs. And we can't take them 100% for what's there. Nobody wore their Shabbos best for baking matzah, right? But if they're going to be drawn, they're going to wear their best. Just like today.
Yeah, I was going to say photographs aren't photographs either.
That's exactly true. That's exactly true. Now, Ronnie, take a look at the people down below. This is the baking of matzah as they go out of Egypt. It's the same people, but they're doing it outside as if they're camping and in family groups. There's another family in the back.
Yes.
Yeah. What's amazing about this is that in the 17th century, we're dealing, remember, with the age of Azaria de Rossi. These are sophisticated people, Italian Jews, and they know that what they do today is not what was always done. It's not like the bird's head, where what we do is what was always done, where we can make that midrashic or agadic connection between matzah baking in biblical times and us. These people know that their way of baking is not the way it would have been done by people going in the desert. And they illustrate that. There's a real historical sense that's developed that you can see through these illustrations. Wait, where did it go? I think I just touched something. Hold on, let me go through again, sorry. There. Now remember, these are contemporary people being read as biblical people who are being read as contemporary people. Here we have contemporary people up above and historical people down below. The space, the modern space between the past and the present has been created in this Haggadah. I think it's just really amazing, and it hasn't been noticed.
right? I mean, because it's a little, it could throw you off the fact that they are in the, as you call it, the historicized or historically minded one of Pesach Mitzrayim, making the matzah and going out of Egypt. They're dressed the same. They're dressed like in the Renaissance. So I think for a modern viewer, you wouldn't assume that they're thinking historically if they're doing that. But obviously the dress is just one component.
And the other thing is, making biblical dress didn't start really until like the 19th century in Europe, when Christians started doing their biblical plays and making biblical scenes, right? Historicized scenes. People dressed up like Protestant Bible paintings, right? And in Israel, it was, I forget her name, someone will know, Leo Cadman's wife, the great coin scholar, who brought that biblicized Tanakh clothes that they used for dancing, but it didn't exist until the 30s or 40s. And so making historicized clothes takes a real jump of imagination that these people weren't there. Mm-hmm. Right? But they did know that it was something different, which I think is just utterly cool. The last one I wanted to show is just for fun, and it's wonderful. This does not look like my mother's matzah. It's from Pune in India. It was created in 1874. Lest we think that the Ashkenazi way of baking matzah is the only way of baking matzah. Up above, down below on the left, we see the ladies grinding, just was done in Yemen until they came to Israel. Up above, they're mixing. And then down below, the ladies putting it on a pan, which is, by the way, how Samaritan matzah is cooked as well, on a pan. Yemenite matzah was traditionally baked in an oven that is open at the top rather than open at the side. Every community is different. And that's the glory of this as we think about it. But what I've tried to do then is say just a little bit about food that we may not pay enough attention to, and illustrations that we don't pay enough attention to, and literary sources that can invest and give meaning to this material. And matzah baking is a great place to do it. So if anyone has never baked matzah, once COVID's over, go do it. You can go to Ellie's backyard, or go to Brooklyn, or to many of the bakeries in Israel, or Mount Gerizim the day before Samaritan Passover, which is about a month different from the Jewish one this year, and watch. So I've got to point out that I once went to a Syrian bakery in Jerusalem a few years ago, and I saw the matzah, and it's thick and it's beautiful, and I could not bring myself, having grown up on that thin Ashkenazi stuff, to eat it. And it was simply visceral. So please, folks, let's talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. This was a great tour. Questions? We had some questions coming in before, but do you have, okay, Ellie was talking about the lever. Ellie, you want to explain that? Ellie Lancy? Or maybe you just were typing it.
I'll show it.
Yeah, so the drier the dough, the harder it is to work. It takes a tremendous amount of muscle power. And you need a dry dough in order to roll it thin. You're not allowed to flour the work surface of matzah. So seeing that, and they still use these giant levers, and I think Professor Fine mentioned that, there are artifacts of these things as well. That tells you a lot about the dough and the kind of matzah they were baking, that they're not thin and crispy and not the softer, more pliable ones, because the dough is very dry.
That's really cool.
Thank you, Ellie. Any questions, guys? You can either send it to me or you can unmute yourself. I can.
So this is more a comment than a question.
Hello, Will Lee. I miss you.
Hi, Steve. I missed you too. And you, Ron.
Will Lee is a esteemed professor of English and my next door neighbor, and he retired, which I think is a sin because I miss him so badly. And hi, Will.
Hi. This is more a comment than a question, or it raises an issue. You pointed out one example of the gendering where the women are basically preparing the, grinding, preparing the dough and so forth, and the man is handling the oven. So, but in the bird illustration, you were saying that the man and the woman to our right, we couldn't see the far right, but there's a gendering there too of an interesting kind, because the woman has her hands stretched out and they're really gesturing toward the man, and her eyes are on the man very clearly. But the man's eyes are depicted as being directed upwards. And he's holding a fork, I guess, and it's as though he's blessing something. So he's sort of more in contact with the divine. So that's another example of a sort of gendering distinction.
You know something? I don't know how divine he is, because that's a Christian gaze upward. I think he's looking upward for sure, but he may be thinking, boy, it's hot in here. You know, I don't know. With these images, we have to be careful not to over read. When they want, somebody else will have an image in mind, but I don't see a lot of looking up to heaven kind of, in the Counter-Reformation style in Hebrew manuscripts. But what's so interesting, Will, is that the gender thing became important in the 19th and early 20th century when machine matzah started, because rabbis could find a way to deal with the issue of having to have the intention of making matzah with a machine, right? They could say the person who turns it on has the intention. It's sort of trivializing, but they could say it, right? But what happens to all those Eastern European Jewish ladies who don't get food for Passover because they don't get to make the matzah? That's a more serious issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are communities that forbade machines for making matzah, specifically because the poor people were dependent upon the money they earned making it.
Oh, for other people.
Yeah, which is really a wonderful thing, right? When you think about the level of sensitivity involved in that. Communal matzah baking became a way that poor people could survive and get their Passover food themselves.
Did it ever happen that one family would make matzah for another, or there would be a sort of centralization where there was sharing out between families?
Yes, there were communal matzah bakeries, and as early as I can think of an early modern one in Carpentras in Provence, but that exists to this day. But communal matzah, doing it together, absolutely. Synagogue matzah bakings for sure.
Steve, look at the chat. There's two questions. One is from my student this semester, Moshe Hecht. And
hi, Moshe.
And there's one from Ilana, all the way from Israel.
Please, I guess I should go to the chat.
The chat.
21.
Moshe can ask this question. Moshe, you want to ask the question?
Yeah, I was curious, like, how much of it was each family doing the matzah baking on their own for their family, or was this more of a communal event? And I guess it differs per community in which area, but mostly was it more of a communal event, everyone will get together, or was it more, I'm just going to do it for my family sort of thing?
Remember, most people only lived among their clan. It's not like us, right? And most people never walked more than 20 miles from home in their lives until the early modern period, and even later, right? And so everyone was related. It's like Teaneck. Everyone was related, right? Or Cincinnati, where everyone's related. You know, there are places where people have stayed for a long time and they're related to each other, and we forget that point, right?
Right.
And so the synagogue may do it, and they're all cousins. I point that out. They're all cousins one way or the other, right? Because everyone, it's like the Samaritans. There were 725 of them at the turn of the century. Now there are 850. They're too related, right? Because of genetic problems. But small Jewish communities had the same deal, Moshe. So the distinction becomes meaningless. Great question. So somebody asked about who the artists were. Well, sometimes it depends. The Bird's Head Haggadah and the Second Nuremberg and the Yehuda, there's no reason to think that this wasn't Jews in a Jewish scriptorium of some sort, right? There are manuscripts that are far finer, like the Rothschild miscellany, which I'm not sure. I haven't studied that question, but I could imagine that kind of input, right? But Ashkenazim had been illustrating Haggadot and continued to illustrate Haggadot into the 18th century.
So they themselves, not hiring Christians to do it.
Right. Sure. Yoel ben Shimon was a major illustrator of some of the finest Haggadot. Yeah, what else?
We have time for at least one question before we wrap up. And, Pesach is a time for questions. But
remember that Shmuel said, Lechem Oni, the bread of affliction, shouldn't be read as affliction. It should be read as Lechem she'onim olav she'lo tarbe, a bread upon which you answer many, many questions. And so remember, when we hold up our matzot, there was a Christian in the early modern period who said that when the Jews held up their matzah, it's like a Christian who holds up the monstrance, which is the container for the host, the level of awe we look at when we look at our matzah. Now, I bought mine at ShopRite. It came in a box from Kfar Chabad, and I'm going to look at it with that level of connectedness that I do every year. But if I'd made it, how much more so? So Ellie, I'm looking forward. We're all coming to your house.
Hope you bought extra flour this year. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all our guests today who tuned in from across the sea and right down the street from me and right up the block from Steve and right on campus at Yeshiva University. And I want to thank our sponsors, the YU Center for Israel Studies, the Rabbi Arthur Schneider Program for National Affairs, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and Judaic Studies at YU, Madei Yadut. For more information about our ongoing programming, for previous recordings of some of our wonderful events and interviews, go to yu.edu/crisis and hope. You can find the wonderful and substantive interview between Rabbi Yossi Blau and former Ambassador Dan Shapiro on soon as Pesach is over, on April 6th at 10:30 in the morning, New York time. We're going to have a virtual tour of the Justo Sierra Synagogue in the historic district of Mexico City. This was an immigrant shul, the first major shul built by Ashkenazi immigrants in Mexico City, and it was refurbished in the last decade by Monica Uniquel, who is a firebrand and a really just a visionary, and she's going to be giving us this tour. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So you can tour the downtown Mexico City without traveling and without smog and without getting stuck in traffic, which is what mostly happens when you try to get to that part of town in the DF. And we have much more. April's going to be a very, very full month. So stay tuned. Again, yu.edu/crisis and hope. And I really want to wish you all a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a wonderful, wonderful holiday. And I know that listening to this exploration of these images will enrich your conversation around the Seder table and throughout the Chag. So thank you so much, and shalom from Yeshiva University.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.